States is declaring war on North Korea. The United States came out and said, no, we're not declaring war, but it looks like things are really ramping up in that area. When you look at that entire area, do you think we are actually going to war with North Korea?
Something could happen by miscalculation, but I think it's such a devastating potential that if there were to be a war, no one knows what the end result would be. And it would be foolish to keep playing games, including the back and forth between Kim Jong-un and Trump. But I think there's a bigger picture here that people have to look at, which is that there is a dynamic in the world which is moving toward a potential for a new financial and economic system. And the hotspots that are being activated today, Ukraine, for example, which is still a potentially dangerous situation. North Korea is probably the most dangerous, but also the whole rhetoric against Iran and so on. Much of this is designed to keep us in the old paradigm of war, competition between North, South, East, West, all of which benefits a banking establishment which is bankrupt. A group of bankers who think they run the world, have had their way for the most part in the last 30 or so years, and they've driven the world economy to the edge of a cliff. And rather than deal with that, their policy is to use the hotspots, which are predictable. Now, the key thing on North Korea is that everyone says Kim Jong-un is crazy, and he may well be, but he's not crazy to think that the United States might possibly go in and carry out a regime change against him. And the idea of North Korea having a nuclear capability, they look at what happened with Iraq when Saddam Hussein shut down his nuclear program. They look at Libya, what happened when Gaddafi shut down his nuclear program, both of which did it in conjunction with the United States, Britain, and NATO. Look what happened with Iran. They signed this nuclear deal. They agreed to give up development of a nuclear weapon, and now they're in a target site again. So from the standpoint of the North Koreans, giving up nuclear weapons would set them up for regime change. Now, besides the overheated rhetoric, I think you have to look at another issue here, which is U.S.-China cooperation and also what Secretary of State Tillerson has been doing. Because Tillerson has made the point, there will be no regime change. We're not going to try and overturn the government. And if you listen to Trump's speech at the United Nations, that was the message of the first part of his speech, that the United States is not a policeman of the world. We're not going to tell other countries what to do. We want cooperation. We want collaboration. And then someone inserted the exact opposite into the speech, where he threatened North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, and Syria. So I think this is a dangerous situation, but the way out of it is cooperation with China. And President Trump will be going to China in early November. He'll probably also meet again with Putin, either at the APEC summit or the ASEAN summit. And so these are opportunities to coordinate more closely a diplomatic solution. And I think it has to work, because if you don't have a diplomatic solution, you're going to have a war which could unleash unbelievable chaos.
Do you think that Trump is compromised right now? Do you think that the cabal, the deep state, the neocons, are they controlling what he does, or do you think he's doing all of this on his own, where the corporate media is out there and they're saying, we're going to war, we're heading into war? Do you think he is compromised by them at this point?
Well, I don't know about compromised. He's definitely surrounded by them, and they definitely have their hands on some important levers of power in Washington. The neocons were never driven out. You have this Dina Powell, who's in the National Security Staff, who's an old Bush operative. You have McMaster, who comes out of the Petraeus network, which was a Bush network. So the people that Trump defeated, smashed really during the presidential campaign on this issue. I mean, what did he go after Jeb Bush on? The Iraq War. He went after all the Republicans on the support for war against Syria, regime change in Libya, the threats to Russia. And now we see him in some cases backtracking on these things. Is it people giving him speeches on this? Is it people controlling the levers? Is it Trump changing his policy? We don't really know. I don't really know. What I do know is that the inconsistency reflects the war to get rid of him. And, he may think he has to make certain concessions, which I think is a mistake. I think you don't compromise with the banksters and their networks. You go after them. If you're going to call them a swamp and say you're going to drain it, you damn well better pull the plug on it. Because I think the problem is that Trump, from the day he won the election, has been targeted by a cabal of the most powerful private interests in the United States and in Britain working together. And the point people for this are former President Obama, who's running operations against Trump, and his operatives such as Comey of the FBI, Clapper from Obama's director of national intelligence, and Brennan from the CIA. And you put that together with the Hillary Clinton networks in the Democratic Party and the traitorous networks in the Republican Party, and then you throw the media barrage against him on Russia, Putin did it, it's an illegitimate election, and so on. And I think Trump is completely surrounded by, and knows he's surrounded by people who are out to run him out of office or kill him. And so I think this plays into it as well. This is a part of what's shaping what he does. So I think instead of people throwing up their hands and saying either Trump's an operative of the deep state or he's been compromised or taken over by them, I think there's a war going on. There's still a war going on. And we've got to make sure that the deep state is defeated.
Now, there's been a couple elections. There's been a couple referendums that's been happening. We've seen Catalonia. That is coming up very soon. They're going to have a referendum. We also see the Kurds. They had a referendum. We also see out in Germany, there was an election with the German party and Angela Merkel supposedly won. You're out there. What are you seeing? What's your take on this election?
Well, what happened in Germany is that the ruling coalition, which is the Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democrats, are destroying Germany. And they're destroying Germany not just by Merkel inviting in immigrants, but inviting in immigrants at the point at which the German economy is being shut down. You have the attack on the auto sector in Germany, and very few Americans know about this, but Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW, they're all being targeted now, not just on diesel engine, but on fossil fuel-powered cars. They're under attack. The Merkel policy is anti-nuclear, anti-technology. She made herself the partner with Obama against Russia, and this is very unpopular in Germany, including with industrialists and medium and small enterprises, businessmen, the so-called Mittelstand. So then you add to that the dislocation from the bringing in the refugees and the fear that people have, especially older people in Germany, that they're going to lose their pensions or they're not going to be able to afford rent. And this opened the door for a collapse of the two ruling parties. So the CDU, Merkel's party, had its worst vote total, 33%, since 1949. Their coalition partner, their sister party, the Christian Social Union in Bavaria, lost 10% of the vote. And then the Social Democrats had their lowest total since the time of Bismarck in the 1880s. So the three ruling parties got smashed. Now, Merkel is going to, the Social Democrats are going to go into opposition. That is, if they survive. And Merkel is going to have to choose coalition partners. And her choices are probably going to be the Greens, who are crazy, and the Free Democrats, who are the worst neoliberals out there, but who disagree with Merkel on Europe. And the other issue here is Germany's role in Europe. Will the Germans accept what Macron is trying to do to make Brussels the center of all budget and all finance in Europe. That is, they'll be basically take away any last resemblance of state sovereignty, national sovereignty. And if Merkel goes along with that, which so far she's been doing, then I think what we saw in this last election, where the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD party, got 13% and came in third, and actually won in Saxony, one of the major Eastern Germany states, and came in second in a number of Eastern German states, they're going to continue to gain. And so Germany becomes ungovernable. Merkel won't have a coalition for 30, 60, 90 days. There'll be no government in Germany, a caretaker government. At a point at which the Italian banking system is going back into crisis, you pointed out the Catalonian referendum in Spain, the continuing problem of terrorism in Europe. So Germany's got to chart a new course. And this is what Mrs. LaRouche, who was very influential in German politics, has been saying. Germany's got to break with the anti-Russian policy and embrace a role in China and the New Silk Road as a way of bringing Europe into that alliance, that new paradigm.
So you mentioned the Silk Road, the Belt and Road. Where do we stand with that? We see there's a lot of countries that are joining up with this. Parts of Europe are joining. What about the United States? Are we getting involved with the Belt and Road?
Well, this is one of the casualties of the Russiagate story, because Trump had a very positive meeting back in March or April with Xi Jinping. And this is in spite of the fact that you had a bunch of people in his administration who were saying China is a currency manipulator, China is a cheater, they're stealing our intellectual property, and so on. Yet he met with Xi Jinping, and then he met with Jack Ma, and he said, look, we can do business with China. Even Bannon, 2 weeks ago, was in China, Hong Kong, and he gave an interview with the South China Morning Post, which is the Hong Kong daily paper there. And he said, look, I respect Xi Jinping. I'm not anti-China. I just want things to be fair. So I think what we're seeing, and Trump did send a representative from the National Security Council to the Belt and Road Conference a couple of months ago. And there have been follow-up meetings where the United States is talking with China about two things. One, can American companies be brought in on some of the major Chinese infrastructure projects? And the Chinese are saying yes. And companies like Caterpillar and some of the other companies that are involved in construction are very hopeful that that can be done. Secondly, the Chinese offered, through one of their leading investment banks, to put up to $60 billion into an infrastructure program in the United States. And God knows we need investments in infrastructure in this country. And Trump is very interested in that. So the potential for the United States to work with China on major infrastructure in South Asia, in the Middle East, the Chinese are talking about spending a lot of money to rebuild Syria, in Africa. And as you mentioned, the Chinese are rebuilding ports in Piraeus and Greece. They're looking at Italian ports. They're investing. The Spanish government just said they want to work with China. So this is a new geometry, a new dynamic in the world. And I would say, just to tie these two things together, with the Brexit vote, the Trump election, and what we just saw in Germany, you have a rejection of the old neoliberal policies, the austerity policies, the deregulation of banking, the free trade policies. There's a rejection of that. We haven't yet moved to a full articulation of an alternative plan, but the Chinese are verging on that with what they're doing with infrastructure as a way of creating credit for physical production, as opposed to what central banks have been doing, creating credit to bail out banks and to keep a Ponzi scheme going. So we're caught between those two paradigms. And what we see in the United States, Dave, really quite simply, is that the media, which is part of this corporate cartel, is out to get rid of Trump because they don't want any possibility that the old paradigm will be rejected. Because if it is, the whole system goes kablooey and they'll lose everything. And the question then is, will we be able to save our country through a collaboration with China and the remnants of Europe, or will the whole world go into complete chaos?
Now, Steve Mnuchin, he was out there and he was talking about sanctions on China and, China saying, don't place sanctions on us because you're going to destroy trade. The trade system will be destroyed if you do this. I mean, if the United States goes ahead and they actually go ahead and place sanctions on China, this is not really going to hurt China, is it? It's really going to hurt us more so than China.
Well, you're right about that because the Chinese are exporting to everyone. But, I think there's an interesting irony here, which is that Trump has said that he's going to have a committee or a commission look into the U.S.-China trade policies. And this is going to take 3 to 6 months before they turn out a report. So we're going to have the next meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping before that. But the Chinese could, if they wanted to play hardball, accuse the U.S. of currency manipulation. I don't think most Americans are aware of this, but the dollar is in terrible shape. I'm aware of it because I'm here in Europe where I have to pay for everything in euros. The dollar has lost 20 cents almost, 18 cents in the year that I've been here to the euro. And it's not because the euro is strong. Now, some people say there's an actual policy to weaken the dollar. I think that's partly what the Federal Reserve has been doing. But I think the other problem is that once you've gone through 6, 7, 8 years of quantitative easing, you can't go back to the old rules and say, okay, now we're going to raise interest rates and that will strengthen the dollar and restore us to the old fiscal stability. There's too much that's happened that's created macro and microeconomic changes. So nobody really knows what will happen if you start raising interest rates and then start dumping all the debt and the bonds and everything else that the central banks have bought to keep money flowing to the bankrupt, too big to fail banks. So there's what you might call unintended consequences that threaten everything. Now, China is somewhat protected. They've got a credit bubble right now, but part of their credit bubble was an overextension of consumer credit, and they're pulling that back. But the other part of what's being called a credit bubble is the tens of billions they're investing in physical economy. Now, when you invest in infrastructure, you can't get an immediate return. That is, unless you're putting up a toll booth, which is stupid, because infrastructure should be cutting-edge technologies that increase the productivity of the whole economic system, so that you have real value added to an economy. And when you do that, it doesn't show up in the balance sheet in the first, second, or third year, but it starts to show up from the creation of new jobs, productive jobs, wealth-producing companies and industries. And that's what the Chinese are doing. That's what we used to do. That was the American system of Alexander Hamilton that enabled us to pay off our Revolutionary War debt. That's what Lincoln did with his greenback policy. That's what John F. Kennedy was starting to do with his issuing of Treasury notes from his executive order in June 1963. And he was combining that with a very sensible policy, an investment tax credit that gave tax incentives for industry to invest in new plant and equipment, hiring new workers, job training, research and development, and so on. So there's a way you can do this. And I think you're right. China is doing it in a, let's not say perfect way, but much better way than we are. We're doing it in the way of a declining imperial power that's living from bubble to bubble and backing it up with military power and the black operations of the regime change and so on. And it's going to blow up. It's going to blow up in our face. And the American people are tired of this. That's why we elected Trump. And if we want it to succeed, we'd better make sure that this deep state operation is defeated.
Now, it looks like the deep state, the cabal, it looks like they're making maybe a last-ditch effort in the Middle East. I mean, they're continuing with North Korea. Ukraine right now seems like it's on the back burner. But in the Middle East, we understand that Syria and Russia, they have cleared almost 90% of the country. of these, paid mercenary terrorists that actually Russia's now showing proof that the United States was behind all of this. But it looks like
this is Obama's regime change policy. The United States was the major supporter of Al Qaeda and ISIS, if not directly, then knowingly, through providing weapons to the so-called opposition forces to Assad.
True. But it looks like they understand that the Islamic State, Al Qaeda, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the moderate rebels, all these different groups that they created, they're pretty much beaten at this time. And it looks like they're changing strategies. It looks like they're destroying some of the coalition bases within Syria. It's like a big mop-up operation. But everyone's looking at the referendums, like the one in Catalonia, and then there's the referendum with the Kurds. But the Kurd referendum, I see as the United States setting this up, where they, built bases, they supplied them with weapons. They said this will be, your land here, your land in Iraq. And it looks like this wasn't a natural grassroots, uprising referendum type of thing compared to Catalonia.
Kirkuk, which would be the center of the Iraqi Kurdish state, is an oil center. And you have that factored into it. But you also have, this overlaps Iran, Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. And these are all states that have been targeted by the Western intelligence community, by the bankers, and others. So this is you have to factor in Israel in this. What's the Israeli policy? They want us to go to war with Iran. They are pushing for that. They're pushing the line that Iran is the terrorist state in the Middle East because of Hezbollah. And they're in a de facto alliance with the Saudis on this. So this is a very dangerous situation in terms of the Middle East. The way out of it would be to continue to work with Russia. The mopping up of the terrorists has been done by Putin's intervention into the Middle East, into Syria. And I think on some level Trump understands that. On some level the U.S. military understands it, because they are doing these deconfliction zones, these so-called safe zones in Syria with the Syrians and with the Russians. But you have another current in there, and who controls that? That's one of the things people should look at.
Do you think that the deep state, they're going to use this whole Kurd type of thing to create chaos in the region?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's the intent. If you go back to the creation of the modern Middle East in the period beginning with World War I through the 1920s, every one of these states that was set up was artificial. But the ones that succeeded, like Iraq and Syria, and to Americans to hear that they succeeded, that might seem strange, but they actually were functioning as secular republics, where you had all the religious differences and the time bomb set up with tribal and ethnic differences, and yet they were working. So what do? We go in and we kill Saddam Hussein. We go in and try and overthrow Assad and throw out his family and break up these multi-ethnic, multi-religious secular governments. So the fact that Syria has survived is a potential for hope in this. But I think the bigger picture here is, as you're pointing out, the so-called deep state, which is really an intelligence extension of the banking community, the largest banks and insurance companies in the world, they're going to keep running these operations because they're losing. Now, it's worth noting that the Russiagate story is running on fumes right now because there's not been a shred of evidence produced. And the VIPS report, the former intelligence professionals who showed that it wasn't a hack but a leak, even though that's been suppressed in the media, it's had quite a big effect. Now think about what happened just this last week with CNN reporting that, in fact, there were FISA warrants taken out against Paul Manafort. Now Manafort was a key operative with Roger Stone and others in getting Trump to run and coordinating his campaign. Manafort also was an advisor to the Ukrainian President Yanukovych who was overthrown by the Soros deep state neocon operation. The first FISA warrant against Manafort was to try to shut him up so he wouldn't talk about the U.S. role in bringing this neo-Nazi regime into power in Ukraine. But the second warrant, and by the way, they admitted that they hadn't gotten any evidence of any corruption by Manafort, so they dropped it. But the second warrant was when he became part of the Trump campaign team. And so Comey and Obama and everyone else lied when they said there was no wiretapping of Trump or Trump's campaign. Now, I don't think we've made a big enough fuss over that. All these guys who are going after Trump are now exposed as liars. Again, Clapper was another case of this. Brennan is another case. Remember, Brennan was the guy who hacked into the Senate Intelligence Committee's computers to try and shut down the investigation of CIA torture. So we're dealing with a gang of criminals who are pointing the finger at Trump, saying, you've got to get this guy. And what do they do to Manafort? They go to his house at 6 a.m, they break in, they pick the lock while he's in there sleeping, and seize documents which he's already provided to the investigation. And then they threaten him by saying, you're going to be indicted, because they're trying to flip him. So I think we're seeing a very desperate operation. And if Trump has any intention of following through on his promises from his campaign, both in terms of taking on Wall Street and taking on this intelligence community, he's got to be out front exposing this corruption, this criminal gang, and proceeding with the alliance with the Russians and the Chinese. So I think we're at a turning point potentially. But, in the United States, there's a bubble, a media bubble, which fake news is everywhere. That's basically all you can get.
That is true. I mean, they don't report on any of this. They only report on the things they want you to hear, and everyone thinks everything else doesn't exist. And that is the bubble.
And that's why Americans are pessimistic, because they say, well, we voted to get rid of Hillary and Obama and the Bush team, and what do we get? Hillary, Obama, and the Bush team. So, the view of most Americans is, we tried and it didn't work. And I think that's a mistake. The victory of Trump was not just an American victory. It was part of this dynamic, which included Brexit, which included this rejection of the Italian government with a referendum there a couple months ago. It includes the vote in Germany. People are dissatisfied. They're angry. They see an arrogant gang stealing their life's work and taking away from their children and grandchildren. But they don't know how to fight it. And that's where leadership is important. And that's why, we with LaRouche PAC are continuing to do what we do, because we think it's important that there be a battle of ideas, that it's not just about who has power, but who has ideas that are right and that can succeed in shifting the geometry.
So where do you think this is all going at this time? Because when you look at the economy, and I'm not talking about the stock market, I'm talking about retail, you're looking at the GDP numbers, the housing numbers that came out, they're absolutely awful. Everything's falling apart very, very quickly right now. And, there's no new manufacturing coming back to the United States. We're not with China with the Belt and Road at this point. The dollar is declining. Can Trump do anything at this time, or is the economy just doomed and they're just going to have to let it fail?
Well, there are some people who are saying that the best thing for him to do is just let it collapse and then try and do a restart. But I don't think that'll work, because the people who are collapsing it are going to be positioned to do the restart. This is why you've got to go with Glass-Steagall as a starting point, because you have to take the power away from the banks. And by that, I don't just mean J.P. Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs, but the Federal Reserve System, but the European Central Bank System. These central bankers have created an unsustainable bubble. Just as an example, leveraged loans to corporations are up 53% this year, and it's at a level that's higher than that of 2007. The Wall Street Journal just had an article on this a couple of days ago saying that the lending to highly indebted companies is a serious problem. This was, Toys R Us as an example of that. The Bank for International Settlements is saying that U.S. companies are leveraged higher than ever, and that either a downturn or higher interest rates could lead to bankruptcy of 20 to 30% of U.S. corporations. And I just saw an interesting interview with a friend of mine who was pointing out that the valuation is completely insane. And he used Snapchat as an example. You know, what's its market cap is something like $50-something billion, and what do they produce? So this is going to blow out. And the problem is you can't say when it will happen or what will trigger it. But as someone at the Adam Smith Institute said last week, this is an accident waiting to happen. And that's why what Lyndon LaRouche has been proposing since before the 2008 crisis is get back to Glass-Steagall, take the power away from the too big to fail banks. They'll not be bailed out. They either have to be commercial banks under strict regulation, or if they're investment banks, they have to eat their own losses. No more bailouts, no bail-ins. And we might as well add no bail for the bankers who are committing the crimes. If you do that as a start, then you can start moving credit through the banking system in major infrastructure programs, Hamiltonian credit policy, which will begin the process of rebuilding the country, not just in terms of the platforms of development, but creating new corporations. As you were just saying, we're not doing that. We need new corporations. We need, and not just startups in so-called tech, but in construction and in metallurgy and things of that sort, machine tool development. This is what we're losing, and this is what we can restore. So either we'll have a collapse, in which case all bets are off, or we can move to a coordinated, organized, thoughtful reorganization of a bankrupt system. And that's what bankruptcy is all about. Not that you lose everything, but that you actually take what's valuable and make sure it can function and write off the bad debt. And the people who have to take the losses are not the taxpayers, but the people who created it.
Now, I just wanted to throw into the mix that there are certain countries now that are selling their oil not using the dollar, like Venezuela, for instance. China and Russia, they're doing business not using the dollar. And of course, Iran, Iraq, eventually Syria, most likely. I mean, a lot of countries are starting to move away from the dollar. I mean, do they know something that we don't?
Well, and some of these countries you mentioned are also buying a lot of gold. Yeah, this is part of the new paradigm that if a system is based on a bubble, if a world system is based on the dollar and the euro and the yen that are all propped up by printing money, by corrupt and criminal central banks, at some point it is going to blow. And I think what we're seeing with the convertibility of the yuan, the various kinds of discussions about oil, I don't think we have a new financial system in place yet, but I think we're seeing a return to the old thinking that currencies have to be backed by something. Now, the best situation is when currencies are backed by stable governments that are ensuring that instead of private interests running the countries are allowing the people to make the decisions and put the investments in areas that will increase real production. So I think that and also you see this with the cryptocurrencies, people who are bailing out on the existing system. You can't overturn it and expect to survive, given that we have over 7 billion people who are interdependent. You need something that will coordinate a cooperative effort to build value. And that's why I think the Belt and Road Initiative is so promising. You look at Africa, which 20 years ago, Africa was a failed continent, a dying continent, the remnants of a colonial looting. And now we see some of the higher growth rates in countries like Ethiopia And the Chinese are heavily investing now in countries that don't have raw materials, but they're training people and they're building railroads and power plants. And so, I think you're right. There's definitely something in the works. People shouldn't fear it. People should embrace it because this old system is dead. It's really, the old joke about you're on the Titanic and you're rearranging deck chairs. That's exactly where we are now, and it's time to get off the Titanic and build something new.
I agree with you. Harley, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. I really appreciate it. Once again, how can people see your work?
Well, we just set up something new where people can go to be in touch with me. It's on the LaRouche PAC site, and it's lpac.co/Harley. And if you want to write to me, it will get directly to me through that. It's the best way to do it. I was somewhat overwhelmed by emails from your listeners, and I did answer them all, but this is a better way to handle it. And I'll also be posting articles and other interviews, so people can go to lpac.co/Harley and get in touch with me.
Harley, I'll put that link at the bottom of the video so everyone can just click on it and go right over there. Once again, thank you very much for being on the Spotlight. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Dave. I always enjoy talking with you.
Me too. Thank you.